A letter arrived on a kitchen table in Sydney in the spring of 1967. It was written in a neat hand, as all his letters were. Precise, measured, the handwriting of a man who did not waste words. His wife Denise had been receiving these letters since August of the previous year, when he had shipped out to a war she had not asked for, in a country most Australians could not have located on a map without help. The letters were always affectionate. They always asked after the three girls. They always carried, beneath the professional composure, a thread of something deeper, a man trying to hold two worlds together across 10,000 kilometers of ocean. But this letter, the last one that would ever arrive, was different. Not in tone, not in handwriting, not in the particular warmth with which he addressed her. It was different in what it said. 11 words that would outlast the man who wrote them, outlast the war that killed him, outlast most of the official histories that buried his story in classified commendation files. It's time I came home. I'm getting bitter and cynical. He wrote those words on the morning of April 7th, 1967. That same afternoon, he climbed out of a jeep near the hamlet of An Thuan, north of the ancient city of Hue, walked into a wall of enemy fire, rallied a company of South Vietnamese soldiers who had broken and fallen back, and was killed by a burst of machine gun fire as he rose to throw a grenade. He was 33 years old. He had been bitter and cynical for approximately 6 hours. The Victoria Cross came posthumously. The letter came first. Wait, you need to stop and sit with that for a moment, because here was a man who, in the 8 weeks before he wrote those words, had done things that veteran soldiers who were present would describe for the rest of their lives. He had sprinted 600 meters across fire-swept ground, alone, to reach a wounded American officer while enemy machine guns tracked him the whole way. He had personally charged a machine gun post, killed the crew, picked up the body of a dead American, and carried it back through the same fire he had sprinted into. He had led a company of men in an assault on a fortified position while his own chain of command was falling apart around him. He had been described by American officers, Vietnamese commanders, and his own Australian superiors in terms that soldiers rarely use for each other. And on the morning of the day he died, what he wrote to his wife was not about any of that. It was about the war itself, about what the war was doing to him, about a growing, gathering darkness that no amount of personal courage could hold back. This story is not simply about a brave man. The world produces brave men in wartime with a regularity that can almost numb you to the fact of their bravery. This story is about what happens when a brave man, a professional soldier of genuine excellence, watches the institution around him fail the people he has been sent to protect, about what it costs, professionally and personally, to maintain your standards in a war that does not share them, about what Peter Badcoe saw in Thu Thien province in 1967 that brought a man of iron discipline to the point of writing those words, and about what the U.S. Army's relationship with that man reveals about the impossible human geometry of coalition warfare. Stay with me. Peter John Badcoe was born in Malvern, a suburb of Adelaide, South Australia, on January 11, 1934. He entered the South Australian Public Service as a clerk in 1950, which gives you some sense of how unremarkable his origins were. But he enlisted in the Australian Regular Army that same year and never looked back. He graduated from the Officer Cadet School at Portsea, Victoria, in December 1952, commissioned as a second lieutenant in the Royal Australian Artillery. In 1961, For reasons that are not entirely clear from the surviving record, he changed his surname from Badcock to Badcoe. He was a man who remade himself quietly, without fuss, and moved on. His early career followed the postings of a competent professional officer in a mid-sized army doing its work in the fading years of the British Commonwealth's operational reach. He served with the 14th National Service Training Battalion. He served with the 1st Field Regiment. He spent a period with the 103rd Field Battery in Malaya from September 1961, serving in the final years of the Federation of Malaya's emergency posture as the British colonial structure wound itself down. And in November 1962, while serving in Malaya, he was sent on a one-week temporary duty attachment to South Vietnam. 7 days, an observation visit, a professional look at conditions in the country where communist insurgents were testing the South Vietnamese government's capacity to hold its territory. That week changed him. You can track it in the decisions he made afterward. He came back to Australia and began angling for an assignment to Vietnam with a persistence that would take him 4 more years to translate into orders. In 1965, he transferred from the artillery to the infantry, a significant career move, the kind that says something specific about where a man believes his future lies. In June 1966, he was promoted to provisional major. On August the 6th of that year, he arrived in Saigon and reported for duty with the Australian Army Training Team Vietnam. The training team. In Australian military history, it occupies a space entirely its own. It was not a conventional combat unit. It was a collection of individual soldiers and small groups, the majority of them warrant officers, the career professionals at the absolute pinnacle of the Australian Army's non-commissioned structure, sent to work as advisors embedded directly with South Vietnamese forces, not alongside South Vietnamese forces, not in the same general province as South Vietnamese forces, inside them, eating with them, sleeping in their compounds, going on operations with them, and dying with them when things went wrong. At its peak strength in November 1970, the entire unit numbered only 227 personnel. In the time it operated, from July 1962 to February 1973, its members received over 100 decorations. 4 of those decorations were Victoria Crosses, the Commonwealth's highest military honor for gallantry under fire. For a unit that never exceeded 227 personnel, that is a ratio that has no parallel in Australian military history and almost no parallel in the history of small unit service in any modern conflict. Badcoe was posted initially as a subsector advisor in the Nam Hoa district of the Hoa Thien province on Vietnam's central coast. His job was specific and, in a peculiar way, unglamorous. He worked with the regional forces and the popular forces, the South Vietnamese territorial militia that Americans in country had given the collective nickname the Rough Puffs. These were not the regular army of the Republic of Vietnam, not the elite units that occasionally attracted American praise and lavish resourcing. The Rough Puffs were district and village-level forces, raised locally, paid poorly, equipped erratically, and carrying the enormous weight of being the population's last line of defense against Viet Cong infrastructure that had been operating in the same villages for years. They were not glamorous, they were essential, and the advisors who worked with them were the men doing the hardest, least acknowledged work in the entire American war. A subsector advisor accompanied Rough Puff companies on operations, provided on-the-job training in the field, oversaw Hamlet security in a way that required him to understand not just military tactics, but the social and political fabric of Vietnamese village life, and, crucially, liaised with the ARVN, the regular South Vietnamese Army, and with American forces in ways that required him to navigate completely different institutional cultures simultaneously. You were never just a soldier in that role. You were a translator in every sense of the word that matters. Badcoe was not a large man. He was short, round, and stocky, with a receding hairline and heavy-rimmed spectacles. He neither drank alcohol nor smoked. He was not the officer who dominated a mess by volume and presence. He avoided boisterous social activities and preferred reading military history. His colleagues found him inscrutable, quiet, privately funny, deeply serious about his work, and absolutely unreachable on matters of professional judgment. Away from the field, he was a family man, wholly and without reservation, writing to Denise and his 3 daughters with the kind of sustained, warm attention that long absences make either impossible or total. For Badcoe, it was total. His wife was his confidant in a way that went beyond the conventional. When the war started to break him, it was to her that he wrote about it. In December 1966, Badcoe was reassigned from subsector work to the position of operations advisor at the provincial headquarters of Thua Thien Province in the city of Hueo. This was a promotion in responsibility, if not in rank. The provincial operations advisor had a broader mandate: planning, liaison, staff coordination, but the latitude the role afforded was considerable, and Badcoe took full advantage of it. When operations were happening in the province, he went. When companies needed leadership, he led. When American advisors were in trouble, he moved. And this is where the story changes texture, because what Badcoe found at the provincial level was not simply a more demanding version of what he had been doing at the district level. It was a view from a higher position of everything that was going wrong. Thua Thien Province in early 1967 was not quiet. It shared a border with the demilitarized zone that separated North and South Vietnam. The ancient imperial city of Huo, which sat at the center of the province, was one of the most culturally and symbolically significant cities in the country. The province was contested in ways that went far beyond conventional military contest. It was a battleground for the political and social narrative of the war itself. And in the countryside outside Hugh's walls, in the rice paddies and fishing villages along the coast, and in the foothills running west toward the Annamite Mountains, the Viet Cong had years of established infrastructure, years of political organization, years of social relationships with village populations that no amount of American firepower had been able to sever. Badcoe had been watching the American approach to this problem since his arrival, and he had been writing home about it in ways that reveal a man whose professional judgment was increasingly at war with what he was witnessing. He was not anti-American. He was not even, by temperament, a critic. He was a professional soldier who had been taught through years of Australian training shaped by the Malayan emergency and the Indonesian confrontation that the population was the terrain, that winning the people's confidence, protecting them from Viet Cong violence without killing them with friendly fire, was not an idealistic addendum to military operations, but the core operational objective. Without that confidence, every village cleared was a village lost again the week after you left. In early February 1967, before any of the actions that would earn him the Victoria Cross, something happened that marked him permanently. The ARVN regiment he was working with called in a napalm strike on a village. The village was occupied by Viet Cong. It was also populated by Vietnamese civilians who, by every account Badcoe could gather, were strongly supportive of the South Vietnamese government exactly the population the war was theoretically being fought to protect. Badcoe and the other advisors in the area tried to stop the strike. They pushed back through every channel available to them. The ARVN divisional headquarters overruled them. The strike went in. When the smoke cleared, 40 civilians were dead or wounded. Their houses were burning. Their families were dead. Badcoe spent a day and a half in that village afterward, not writing reports, not filing formal protests, working, getting bodies out of the rubble, finding shelter for survivors, getting food distributed. He later wrote to Denise about it with a rawness that sits strangely against the careful professional restraint that characterized most of his correspondence. What do you say to them when their houses have been burnt, their families burnt to death? I was so furious and disgusted, I don't think I said a word all day. I just couldn't speak. He could not speak. A man who had spent his professional life in the controlled, precise, verbal environment of military command, briefings, reports, orders, after-action assessments, found himself standing in a burnt Vietnamese village without words. The silence is more telling than any amount of analysis. Something had cracked. Not his will, not his capacity, something else. The belief, perhaps, that the institution he was serving was capable of protecting the people it claimed to be protecting. He concluded, somewhere in those hours, that the war was unwinnable. That specific word appears in the surviving accounts of his thinking. Not that the military situation was difficult, not that the enemy was resilient, not that the challenges of counterinsurgency required adjustment. Unwinnable. A man with his history, who had spent his adult life inside military institutions, who had chosen this posting over a conventional career path, who had been reading military history since before most of his American counterparts had finished high school, arrived at the judgment that the war, as it was being conducted, could not achieve what it claimed to want. He reached that conclusion in early February 1967. He would be dead by April 7th. In the intervening 2 months, he performed the 3 actions that constitute the Victoria Cross citation. February 23, 1967. The rice-covered coastal plains of Phu Thu District. Badcoe was advising a regional force company in support of a sector operation when the radio crackled. The message was brief, as battlefield radio messages tend to be, but the meaning was clear. On the flank, approximately 600 meters away, a popular force platoon had run into serious trouble. An American subsector advisor, Captain Clement, had been mortally wounded going to assist a wounded soldier and was lying in front of the platoon's position, 50 meters from an enemy machine gun post. A second American, a medical advisor, had been wounded and was in immediate danger of being overrun. The body was under direct observation of the enemy's gun. The living man was running out of time. Badcoe put down the radio and started running. 600 meters. Across ground that was being swept by enemy fire. Not crawling, not moving in short bounds from cover to cover the way the infantry tactical manual would suggest. Running, the American sergeant accompanying him, Captain James Custer of the United States Marine Corps, watched him go and did not believe what he was seeing. The fire intensified as Badcoe approached the platoon's position, as if the enemy had not been expecting anyone to actually attempt what he was attempting. He reached the wounded medical advisor, attended to him, and got him to a position of safety. He then turned around, organized the popular force platoon, which had understandably gone to ground, and led them in a frontal assault on the machine gun post. He personally killed the crew. He then retrieved the body of Captain Clement, who was dead, and carried it back across the fire-swept ground to the regional command post. He had gone out empty-handed and come back with a dead man in his arms. That was one day, one morning, in fact. Later that same day, word reached him that the reaction company of the 1st ARVN Division was in difficulty near the hamlet of An Thuan. Viet Cong forces had hit the position hard, and the South Vietnamese company was faltering. The detail that decided Badcoe's next action was specific, and, once you understand the mechanics of the war in Thu Thien Province, grimly logical. Air support was unavailable to South Vietnamese forces unless Allied advisors were present on the ground. This was not an accident. It was a deliberate structural requirement, designed to ensure that American air assets were not called into action by South Vietnamese commanders operating without Western guidance. In practice, it meant that a South Vietnamese company in trouble had no air support unless it had an advisor, and the advisor it needed had to get there first. Badcoe drove to An Thuan. He found the reaction company had fallen back under withering fire. He took charge, moved among the men, and by force of personal example, and the kind of authority that comes not from rank, but from presence, got them moving forward again. He set out in front of the company. The South Vietnamese soldiers followed. They pushed into the fire until they were stopped again by a machine gun that was tearing through the line. Badcoe made several attempts with grenades to silence it. At one point, the American sergeant accompanying him physically pulled him back out of the line of fire. He got up and tried again. He did not silence the gun that day. He would come back for it on April 7th, March 7th, 1967, early morning. The district headquarters of Quang Dien, near Hue, came under attack from a strong Viet Cong force. The headquarters was the kind of target whose fall would carry political and symbolic weight far beyond its tactical value. The sector reaction company was deployed to respond, but the command group's vehicle broke down en route, and an American officer was killed in the resulting chaos. Badcoe, who had been with the command group, did not stop when the vehicle stopped. He joined the company headquarters and personally led the company across open terrain to assault and capture the enemy's heavily defended position. In the face of certain death and heavy losses, his Victoria Cross citation reads, his personal courage and leadership turned certain defeat into victory. The district headquarters was saved. These three actions, February 23rd, March 7th, April 7th, were cited together in the London Gazette on October 17, 1967, in the announcement of the Victoria Cross awarded posthumously to Major Peter John Badcoe. The citation is dry, as military citations tend to be, but between the lines of its controlled language something extraordinary is visible. 3 separate actions spread across 6 weeks, each one extraordinary enough to stand alone, each one performed by a man who had already concluded that the war could not be won. This is not a contradiction. This is, in fact, the most important thing about Peter Badcoe, that he had separated the question of whether the war was winnable from the question of whether the men fighting it deserved his best effort. They did, so he gave it. The relationship between Badcoe and the American advisors around him was complicated, and the complication is worth examining carefully, because it is part of why he wrote what he wrote on the morning of April 7th. American advisors in Vietnam in 1960s operated within a system that was producing outcomes Badcoe found increasingly difficult to accept. This was not primarily a question of individual courage or individual competence. There were brave and competent American advisors working alongside Vietnamese forces in Thu Thien Province, and Badcoe worked closely with some of them. The February 23rd action, the sprint across fire-swept ground, was undertaken specifically to save American lives and recover an American body. His relationship with the American officers and NCOs on the ground was, by all accounts, respectful and productive. The problem was institutional. American advisory policy in 1967 was embedded in a larger American strategic framework that measured progress through metrics: body count, pacification assessments, Hamlet security ratings, that did not actually measure the thing Badcoe believed mattered: the population, their security, their confidence, their willingness to give the South Vietnamese government the one thing no number of American soldiers could provide through force: the basic social cooperation without which governance is impossible. American advisors were working within a system that incentivized the wrong behaviors, rewarded the wrong outcomes, and too often treated the Vietnamese forces and Vietnamese civilians as instruments of American strategic calculation rather than as the human reality that the entire enterprise was supposed to serve. Badcoe could see the Vietnamese. This sounds like a simple thing. It was not. Thua Thien Province was not an abstraction to him. He had spent months in its villages, at its district headquarters, on its rice paddies, and along its coastline. He had eaten with the men he advised. He had organized food and shelter for their families after American airstrikes burned them out. He had stood in the ruins of burnt houses and been unable to speak. He had acquired, in the language of the Australian War Memorial's account of his service, an affectionate regard for the soldiers he trained and led. He traded spirits and cigarettes from the Australian canteen with American Marines in Da Nang, not for personal benefit, but to acquire equipment for his poorly supplied Vietnamese troops. He donated food and supplies to a local orphanage. These are not the actions of a man who maintained professional distance. I can see more and more good about the Vietnamese and less about the U.S. advisors. This is the sentence, the companion to "I'm getting bitter and cynical," that completes the last letter. It has been quoted many times in accounts of Badcoe's service, and it is almost always quoted as evidence of his disillusionment. But it is worth reading more carefully than that. He did not write less and less about the Americans. He wrote less and less about the U.S. advisors. He had been working alongside American advisors for months, watching how they operated, watching how they related to the Vietnamese soldiers they were supposed to be training and supporting, watching the gap between the institutional framework they were working within and the human reality they were standing in the middle of. He had watched napalm fall on a pro-government village because someone in a divisional headquarters overruled the advisors on the ground. He had spent a day and a half in the aftermath of that decision, unable to speak for fury. The bitterness and cynicism he described were not the bitterness of a man who had given up. A man who had given up does not climb out of a jeep on the morning he writes his last letter home and walk into enemy fire to rally a company of South Vietnamese soldiers. The bitterness was the bitterness of a professional who can see clearly what needs to happen, and who is surrounded by institutional structures that prevent it from happening, and who does not have the power to fix the institutional structures. He could fix the immediate problem. He could always fix the immediate problem. He ran toward immediate problems with a consistency that earned him a nickname, the Galloping Major, that followed him through every account of his service. But the immediate problem kept regenerating because the conditions that produced it were unchanged. April 7, 1967. Morning, he wrote the letter. He sealed it and presumably gave it to someone to post. Then he went to work. The 1st Division Reaction Company was in difficulty near An Thuan, the same hamlet where he had led men forward 2 months earlier. The same structural requirement applied. Air support was unavailable without an advisor present. Badcoe knew this. He drove to the scene. He found the South Vietnamese company, again under heavy fire, again falling back. The position they had been trying to take included a machine gun that had been causing devastating casualties. Badcoe took charge. He moved among the men as he had done before, using the authority of physical example rather than the authority of command rank. The South Vietnamese soldiers, who had seen him do this before, who knew what the galloping major looked like when he decided something needed to happen, began to follow him. They pushed forward into the fire. The machine gun did not stop firing. Badcoe made several attempts with grenades to silence it. Each time he had to expose himself to throw. At one point, and this detail, recorded in the formal citation, is the kind of detail that carries more weight the longer you look at it. The American sergeant accompanying him pulled him physically out of the line of fire. He rose again to throw another grenade. A burst of machine gun fire hit him. He fell and did not get up. He was 33 years old. His memorial service in Hue drew the largest attendance that could be recalled for any Allied soldier during the Vietnam War. Vietnamese soldiers and officers, American officers, Australian colleagues. They came in numbers that are hard to explain through the ordinary arithmetic of military respect. They came because something specific and irreplaceable had been lost, and everyone who had been close enough to see it knew it. His widow Denise, remembering that he had once told her he found military funerals horrendous for families, arranged for him to be buried at the Terendak Garrison Cemetery in Malacca, Malaysia. He had served there. He had been happy there. In the measured, private way he was happy anywhere away from Denise and the girls. His headstone bears the inscription she chose. He lived and died a soldier. 7 words, exactly the right 7 words. The Victoria Cross was announced in October 1967. The United States awarded him the Silver Star twice with an oak leaf cluster. He also received the Purple Heart, the Air Medal, and more decorations from the Republic of Vietnam than most Australian officers accumulate in a career. South Vietnam's National Order, 3 crosses for gallantry, the Armed Forces Honor Medal. These were awarded by a government that understood, perhaps better than any outside assessor could, what it meant to have someone fighting for your country who could have been anywhere else. But the posthumous honors that say most about what Badcoe meant to the people around him are not the official decorations. In November 1967, the first Australian support compound in Vung Tau opened a rest and recreation facility for troops. They named it the Peter Badcoe Club. Australian soldiers coming off operations in Phuoc Toi province, coming down from the rubber plantations and the rice paddies and the ambush positions in the long high mountains for 3 days of beer and beach, walked through the doors of a building that carried his name. They ate and drank and argued and recovered in a space that announced, "We remember." The club operated throughout the remainder of the Australian commitment to Vietnam. Every soldier who passed through it passed through a monument to the kind of service Badcoe had rendered. Buildings at the Officer Cadet School at Port C were named for him. The main lecture theatre at the Royal Military College Duntroon bears his name. A divisional building at the Australian Defence Force Academy. A roadside rest area on the Federal Highway between Sydney and Canberra, where travellers can stop and read about a man most of them have never heard of. The South Australian electoral district of Badcoe. And since 2004, the Port Adelaide Football Club in the Australian Football League has awarded the Peter Badcoe VC Medal to the player who best demonstrates skill, courage, self-sacrifice, teamwork, and fair play in the club's Anzac Day match. A sports medal for a dead soldier given every April to a young man who plays football on a day set aside for the dead. In 2008, his medal set was auctioned for $488,000 Australian, purchased by media owner Kerry Stokes in collaboration with the government of South Australia. In February 2016, Denise Badcoe presented the decorations to the Australian War Memorial in Canberra. They are now on permanent display in the Hall of Honour, the 71st medal set, containing a Victoria Cross in the memorial's collection. There is a question that every account of Peter Badcoe circles without quite landing on. It is the hardest question the story raises, and it needs to be asked directly. Did the institutional failure he described in his last letter contribute to his death? This is not a question about whether specific American decisions on April 7th were wrong. The action that killed him was a South Vietnamese company in trouble in a hamlet north of Hue, and the requirement for an advisor to be present to secure air support was a structural feature of the war that had been in place long before Badcoe arrived. What killed him, technically, was a machine gun burst in a position he exposed himself to because he was throwing a grenade at an enemy post to keep South Vietnamese soldiers moving forward. The harder question is whether the accumulated weight of watching a war go wrong, the napalm strike, the unlistened to objections, the institutional structures that kept producing the same destructive outcomes regardless of what advisors on the ground believed, contributed to something in Badcoe's operational behavior that was, by the standards of rational risk management, past the point where any reasonable soldier should have been operating. He had already done more than enough. He had already performed 3 actions that individually justified the highest military honor his country could bestow. He could have been on the radio on April 7th rather than in the Jeep. He could have been at the provincial headquarters rather than at the scene. The structural requirement was for an advisor to be present, not specifically for that advisor to be Peter Badcoe. But that was not who he was, and the bitterness and cynicism he described that morning, the gathering darkness that no amount of personal courage had been able to stop, may have accelerated the one thing in the war that he could still directly control: his own forward movement. If you cannot fix the institution, you can at least fix the immediate problem. You can always run toward that. He ran toward it until the day it ran out. The American officers who served alongside him understood this about him, even if the institutional framework they operated within did not allow them to fully act on what he represented. The Americans who were present on February 23rd, the men whose lives he saved by running across that fire-swept ground, spoke about him afterward in terms that went beyond the professional respect of Allied officers for a decorated colleague. They spoke about him the way soldiers speak about someone who showed them something they could not have shown themselves, something about what it looks like when a man has genuinely integrated the welfare of the people he is fighting alongside into his own operational identity, not as a doctrine, but as a fact. The U.S. Army institutionally couldn't keep up with him, not because American soldiers lacked courage. American soldiers in Vietnam produced acts of individual courage in numbers that cannot be counted. But Badcoe's courage was not separable from his judgment, and his judgment was not separable from his relationship with the Vietnamese soldiers and civilians he was working with. That combination, the fusion of professional excellence with genuine personal commitment to the people the war was supposed to be protecting, was what the American advisory system, as it operated in 1967, found most difficult to replicate, and, at the institutional level, most difficult to sustain. His last letter said, "I can see more and more good about the Vietnamese and less about the U.S. advisers." It was not an indictment. It was an observation made by a man who was running out of road about what happens when institutional incentives push advisers away from the population they are supposed to be protecting and toward the statistics that make their commanders happy. He saw it clearly. He said it clearly. He died before anyone in a position to act on it had to respond. In the years after Vietnam, Peter Badcoe's name never entirely faded from Australian military memory, but it occupied a particular kind of quiet, the quiet of someone who is honored without being fully understood. The decorations were given, the buildings were named, the medal was struck, but the question his service raised, what it actually costs to do the advisor's job correctly, what it takes to truly integrate yourself with a foreign force and fight their war with them rather than alongside them, remained largely unaddressed, because addressing it would have required the larger institutions to look honestly at what the war had asked for and what it had actually gotten. Badcoe had given it what it asked for, all of it, and on the morning of April 7, 1967, sitting down to write to Denise before going out to die, he told her that it was costing him something he couldn't get back. Not his courage, not his judgment, not his love for her and the girls, which comes through in every letter with a warmth that the official record cannot contain. What he was losing was the part of himself that believed the institutional framework around him deserved the best he had to give. "I'm getting bitter and cynical" is not a soldier's cry of despair. It is a professional's diagnosis of a system that was failing the people it was supposed to serve. He wrote it. He sealed it. He got in the Jeep. He drove to Antoine and did what needed doing until the machine gun stopped him. The letter arrived at a kitchen table in Sydney. Denise read it. She already knew he was gone, because the army had told her before the letter arrived. That is how it works. The official notification comes before the words. She read the words of a man who had told her everything, who had always told her everything, and who had, in his last communication with the world he was fighting to get back to, told her that the war was breaking something in him. His headstone says he lived and died a soldier. What it does not say, what the headstone cannot hold, is the rest of what he was. A man who looked at the people he was supposed to protect and saw them clearly enough to be destroyed by watching them harmed. A man whose bitterness and cynicism were the direct measure of how much he cared. The galloping major, always on the go, running toward every immediate problem that the long structural failure around him could not stop producing. Running until the morning, he sat down to write 11 words to his wife, and then ran one last time. 600 meters of fire-swept ground, and then April 7th, and then the letter on the kitchen table in Sydney, lest we forget.